Today is February 6, 2007. My name is Don Linky. We're here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick to conduct another in the series of interviews for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive compiled by the Rutgers program on the governor. This afternoon we'll be speaking to Linda Cooper about her role in the 1973 Byrne gubernatorial campaign, the creation of the State Energy Office and development of the state energy policy, and later in the Department of Labor and Industry. Linda, why don't we start with just some brief overview of your family upbringing and how eventually you got to know and work for Brendan Byrne.
Okay. I was born in New Jersey, in Paterson, New Jersey, an urban kid from the get-go, and got involved after I was married with two small children at a very young age. Got involved with local politics in Montclair. Montclair happened to have the headquarters for SANE. It happened to have the League of Women Voters, and I happened to have two small babies. So I was very involved in children's issues, women's issues, and protecting and making safe the world that we lived in. That was the SANE connection.
For those younger people who will be watching this, describe SANE.
Well, SANE was an organization that was dedicated to a sane world where nuclear energy and nuclear power was not unleashed. It's not too different from what it's about today, non-proliferation, concern about atomic weapons, and so forth.
What are your memories of Paterson?
Oh, well, when I was growing up, I lived in an environment where there were families in apartment buildings and 6 family houses. Many of them were immigrants from Central Europe. We played on the sidewalks, we played ball, we roller skated until our feet were numb. It was a happy and active time. It was a very, I was thinking about this, it was a pretty interesting time to be a child. This was in the 40s. I remember everyone, because of the nature of the community there, being very, very interested in politics and government, because they came from places where politics and government were so hard. And they took a very active interest. And of course it was the war years. And so everyone had someone in their family who was in World War II, one way or the other. And so things that were going on at the time, just in the world at large, I think were in the consciousness of maybe my generation, and certainly of the kids that I played with and knew of as I was growing up.
Of course, Paterson has a very prominent role in labor history. Did any of your family have labor ties?
Well, not directly, but yes, our neighborhood was full of I would say probably ultra left-wing, even some members of Communist Party members and labor activists. It was that time. And so it was very interesting in that regard. Not my family so much, my immediate family, but in the wider community, in the wider family at large. And in the first school I went to, I lived right down the block from an elementary school. It was an ancient school building. Much of those city-numbered school buildings were. It was the same school as a number of people who still lived in that neighborhood had gone to before the waves of immigrant families came in. And I can remember, large classrooms and classical kinds of settings that one would describe today as probably archaic, in many respects.
Describe more your early political activity, both with nonprofits and more formal politics.
Well, the first real encounter that I had with the political process came through work on advocacy on children's rights, justice for children. It was a big Justice for Children initiative, and this is in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was involved very much in that. And I remember the very first political figure that I ever came in contact with was Millicent Fenwick. And we were at one of these very large conferences where there must have been 500 women all concerned about a Bill of Rights for children in an advocacy sense. And I remember, her own inimitable style, she, pulled me over in a classroom. We were sitting there with maybe 15 or 20 women. And she pulled me over in one of those chairs with the desks in the front. It was classroom style. And she said, in her way, "Oh, so tell me, my dear, why are you here, and what is your interest?" And if anyone has ever remembered meeting her, she was quite an imposing woman. And I was kind of tongue-tied. I didn't quite know what to say to this very elegant woman. But we did engage in conversation, and she said, "Well, you must come to Washington and express some of these things in places where perhaps we can do more good." And I always took that to heart. She was very empowering as a woman figure, and I always appreciated that. I don't know whether that alone was enough to propel me into politics and candidacy and those kinds of things. But I always was interested in the wider issues, and it was again a product of the times that women were in fact being engaged more and more. And as I got engaged more and more, it grew away from the family-oriented, children-oriented kind of a world to the larger world. I got involved in presidential politics in the McGovern campaign. That was the first campaign I had ever really been involved as a campaign volunteer worker. And I was absolutely fascinated by not so much the candidacy of for the president, but the way in which campaigns worked. That was a world that was new to me, and I found it intriguing. I worked at the county level during the McGovern campaign, and I began to learn about New Jersey and the counties and the county chairman and the roles that people played, and there's kind of a ballet to campaigns that I find to this day intriguing and fascinating. I was fascinated by campaign statistics and numbers, and how you could use the past to protect the future, and how campaigns organized themselves, and how they did their business of electing people. And that was my first cut at real politics.
Describe more what they asked you to do as a volunteer in that campaign.
Oh, well, there was, in that campaign, which was maybe not typical because there was a very strong outside influence. I was a grassroots person. I came from the community, where most of the people who were operating, who were not from the county apparatus and the traditional party apparatus. I was outside of that as an independent, nonpartisan kind of person. I didn't come from Democratic or Republican activities. I came because I was concerned about the presidency. That's how I got there. And there were many people who were from the outside. They were outside consultants that were heavily involved in running presidential campaigns. And so I did whatever was needed to do in a local office, and people discovered that I could actually do things. You know how it is in a campaign. If you can do something, you're it. If you volunteer, it's yours. And so I found that by the time Election Day rolled around, I was doing Election Day election poll for the county, for Essex County, out of East Orange headquarters. And so it was one of those kinds of campaigns, and I learned a lot. And I learned very quickly about the organizational structure and how one actually can go about winning or losing campaigns, and how one can tell in advance whether or not you're going to win or lose. It's not really a mystery in many times.
Who were the key political people that you had some contact with in those days?
Well, in those days it was really local community leaders more than it was the political party apparatus itself, but that was the nature of the McGovern campaign. It was a little disjointed that way. It didn't really come. I think the McGovern campaign in New Jersey was to some degree imposed upon the state rather than organic, if you will. So that was that was something that was quite different. What was important for me in all of that was understanding the ways in which many faces from New Jersey were critical to making things happen or not happen. Who would work for a candidate, or whether they would go through the motions, for example, was something that I found illuminating. And at the time I was processing a lot of information, both internally, meaning coming from within the state, and externally. So there weren't real key leadership people that I was engaged with, and that was part of the problem with the McGovern campaign, is that it did not really engage terribly well, and that was the lesson learned.
Of course, Senator McGovern was beaten very badly in that election.
Very, very badly.
Did you ever have any hopes from the start that he had a chance?
I never knew until halfway through the general election campaign how impossible it really was. I was very idealistic. I thought that Richard Nixon was going to be a disaster as a president. I was very much aware of all the negatives about Richard Nixon more than I was about the positives of McGovern, although I thought he was a smart, kind man who had a good heart and had experience that I thought would be useful. But I don't think I honestly recognized I was working so hard, day and night, working so hard, that I really was blinded to the facts that maybe were obvious to people who had been more politically astute right from the or more politically practiced, let's say, right from the very beginning. But it was about halfway through when I learned from people how to read the numbers, how to actually go through and analyze election statistics and election information, and that it really was going to be very difficult. And then election day came, and I told you I was doing the election day poll out of the East Orange office, and I knew it was lost, but it only hit me until it hit me when it was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on election day, and I had pulled every district that we had, and it was only mid-afternoon, and there was nowhere to go. So, I mean, it was kind of like I could have packed up shop and left, but I couldn't. I had to stay there to the bitter end, and it was a very bitter end. And so that was a huge growing and lessons learned for someone like myself who had never really had her hands in any kind of political. Always considered myself a Democrat, always, because I was raised in a family where everyone was Democrats, and everyone voted with great pride. I mean, I was taken by the hand as a 2-year-old, and my mother's sister used to take me to vote for anything under the sun. You voted, that's what you did, and you voted as a Democrat, that's what you did. So that's the way I was raised. But the lessons learned from actually getting your hands into a political campaign are a different set of lessons. Non-public policy, just operationally fascinating. I found fascinating. One of the things that I could leap forward to was the period in this. I'm not going chronologically now. I'm just skipping ahead. Is that during that period of time, I became really fascinated with the whole world of political science. That's really where that happened for me. Even though in college I was not at all interested in politics or political science, but I became fascinated by all of this and the institutional aspects of it, how government operated, how the politics and government and policies were made, the big debates over whether it was policy or politics, and all of the nuances of that were just a whole new world for me, and I was just fascinated by it. It brought me to the doors of this institution where we're sitting today at Eagleton. Someone had, I guess someone had recommended me to Winona Littman, who was in the legislature in those days, and she wrote me a letter of recommendation to come here and be a fellow, in the Women in Politics program, which was just getting off the ground. And I could never do it, and I regret it somewhat to this day. Could never do it because I was commuting to Trenton, living in Montclair, raising 2 kids and how much can super mom do. You know, that's really what that period of time was.
But the McGovern defeat didn't sour you on politics. What was your next step?
No, it was very interesting. We had a very nice group of grassroots people. These were not necessarily party people. They were, a lot of them were, they were all Democrats, but they weren't involved in the party politics so much in their communities. They were independent-minded, and they decided that with the gubernatorial election coming the year after the presidential, that we should try to hold our little group of people together, and maybe with all the things that we had seen and learned and done, that we could have some effect. Given the fact that we now had a Republican in the White House, we wanted to make sure that we had a Democrat and a good government type of Democrat in the State House. And so to the extent that we could, we would get together, we would talk, we would caucus, we would this, we would that, and we got involved very, very early on. There were many candidates out there, some of whom we knew would never end up in the State House, but we wanted our group to stay together. It ended up fracturing. It didn't stay together. Very early on, I was involved in the Coffee campaign. Dick Coffey was the Mercer County, a senator, right, senator. And he, you know, I knew he wasn't going to end up being the governor, but it was interesting to watch that apparatus being put together. A lot of the other people went to the Ann Klein campaign. She was running in that primary against Brendan Byrne. And there were, so it didn't stay together. The group didn't stay together. It kind of went each way.
Who were some of the other people in your group?
Oh, I can't even remember their names now. They were just people like me who had no power base. They weren't a power structure. They were just people, and all volunteers. All volunteers. None of us were ever paid a dime by any of the campaigns. We all volunteered our time, and did it day and night. I mean, it was everything from sending out mailings to organizing events, to knocking on doors, to writing issue papers. You know, many times communities would want to know more than campaigns would provide in the way of literature. So we used to write our own. We would write position papers. We would call and talk to people. We would work out of the headquarters offices. We would keep the offices open. We would do all those kinds of the grunt work of campaigns. We would do all those sorts of things.
Were you approached by some of Dick Coffey's people about getting involved with the campaign?
I believe there was some contact. It's all kind of vague now, but I think there was some contact personally. But I don't remember the people. I don't remember the names anymore. It was a long time ago. But I do remember that there were still groups of people, not myself necessarily, who were trying to make forays into various campaigns to figure out what they were going to be and how they were going to evolve. The campaigns, the Coffee campaign, for example, was there before Brendan Byrne declared. As a matter of fact, I was in, I'll never forget this, I was in the Oranges somewhere at a meeting where I was supposed to be, a community meeting, where I was supposed to be telling people what Dick Coffey's campaign was going to be all about. And I got a phone call that said, Dick's not going to run anymore. Brendan Byrne is going to be the candidate. And I said, gee, I've heard that name for a long time, but I've never met the man. And I remember I walked into this meeting and people said, well, we hear that Dick Coffey isn't going to run anymore, and we hear it's Brendan Byrne, and where does he stand on this issue, and where does he stand on that issue? And I said, listen, I said, I don't know. I said, I only know what I've heard anecdotally, and I'm not going to represent his interest and repeat that to you without any authorization from him to do so. And I conducted an entire meeting, and I said, you know what, why don't you tell me what you want to know, and I'll make sure that you get the answers. What else could I say? But I had learned those political lessons well, you know, that I wasn't going to wing it and make it up from, you know, from whole cloth, that I was going to wait and see. And I did, somehow the people who had been working for Dick Coffey, we all kind of went different ways. I began to look into what Brendan Byrne was all about, And I got engaged. It was and I may have the calendar a little off here, but there was an open primary suit that was being discussed. That's what engaged me first. And he was supporting that. And there was a real question about who gets on the ballot and how candidates actually have access to the primary system. And I thought that was really important. And that was my first contact with him in the campaign, had to do with that legal issue. And that's how I think I got engaged with him in the first place. It was over the open primary suit, and that was very important. So all along the way, I think one of the things that brought me to that campaign and to get to know him was really the lessons I had learned about trying to separate out the truth and the fiction of campaigns and people and what they really stood for. It's a sorting out process to some degree. And so that's how I got engaged, was through the open primary suit.
Now, two of the people who began with the coffee campaign, who later became very significant players in the Byrne campaign, were Dick Leone and Lou Caden. Did you have any contact with them before Brendan Byrne entered the race?
Not with them directly. I knew who they were because I was working at I was engaged in the statewide efforts. And so I was working at a community level. That's where I always stayed. I was always very comfortable at a community level. I think you always had a really good feeling for where things were going to go if you could get a good read on what the communities were thinking and what they were all about. I'm kind of a grassroots person. And so I knew who Dick was, and I didn't know who Lou Caden was. I did know who Dick Leone was. But no, I didn't have any direct contact. He was working at a state level and I was working at a community level, so there was, we didn't have any direct contact. But as things progressed then, and I got more and more engaged, and we all ended up in the headquarters together, then of course I knew who he was then.
Now, after you learned while conducting this meeting that Dick Coffey was withdrawing from the race, what was your next step?
Oh, gee. I don't remember. There was a gap. There was a gap in there, and there were organizational things going on that I think I connected through. There was a consultant. There was a consultant that was brought on during the very early stages to help organize the campaign, and I'd forgotten the name of it. It was before David Garth was involved. That was later, but there was some outfit, and I can't remember their name. And I was called by them, I think, and I don't know how they must have gotten my name from the previous work I'd done. And they contacted me, and then I worked mostly in Essex County because that's where I lived. I lived in Montclair, and I knew that well. And because I had worked on the McGovern campaign, I knew the campaign statistics from Essex County pretty well, and that's how I got involved with them.
Of course, the Essex County organization was not backing Brendan Byrne.
No, that's right. Well, it's just why some of the information that I had was useful, because the county chairman was not backing. And yet I had worked Essex County for the presidential the previous year, so a lot of what I knew and a lot of the people that were engaged in the McGovern campaign then became important in Essex County because the county chairman wasn't supporting Brendan's candidacy.
Well, describe the atmosphere in bucking the county organization at that time, which probably was very strong in terms of deciding political careers.
Right. It was for me, who was never engaged with the county apparatus in the first place, I felt particularly uncomfortable because I never knew if I was walking through a minefield. You never knew. You never knew if you were engaging with people who were just going to be using information that you could provide in ways that were not going to enhance the candidacy of the governor. And so it was difficult. As it evolved, I moved into the state headquarters and out of the county apparatus because it was very difficult. It was very difficult. We never had we never had the full support there that we otherwise would have had, with quite a bit of of hands-on. So when we went to the state headquarters, and I worked at the state headquarters, I remember there was one brief attempt, and it was funny in a way. There was one brief attempt to set up an old-fashioned Kennedy-style boiler room where we would have, each of us it was an experiment, and each of us was going to take a county, and several of us were assigned to Essex County because we were from Essex County, and we were going to try to engage with the county from the headquarters. And I think after, I don't know whether it was Dick who found out about it or somebody else, I can't remember whose bright idea it was in the first place, but we just canned the whole thing because there was no way that somebody like myself was going to pick up the phone and call Harry Lerner, the county chairman in Essex County, and try to engage him. That was just not going to be the way it worked. So the boiler room concept dissolved. But we were struggling. We were always struggling with some of that situation.
Now, you say before you went to the state headquarters it was difficult at the county level. Did the county organization actively try to undermine what you were up to?
Not really, no, because we were really working at such a grassroots level, where we were really using the same techniques we had used during the McGovern campaign. And we did have those contacts, so we could call those people and we could say, would you like to help us out here? So first was establishing the relationships that we had before, trying to get communities, neighborhoods, really, really grassroots. And so no, we didn't bump into the problems at that level.
Now, how did you get down to the state headquarters, and was there a particular contact that helped you get a position down there?
I don't actually recall how I ended up there. I don't remember. I just remember it was a very large space, and everyone was there. And Marty Greenberg had an office there. Dick had an office there. Don Land had an office there. Joe Hoffman came in. He had an office there. Dan, what's his name from Hudson County? I can't remember now.
Horgan. Dan Horgan.
Yes.
Dan Horgan.
Dan Horgan had an office there. There was a whole fundraising apparatus. There was a press office. There was, we had a whole operation. And there was always a problem with the scheduling office, but I worked in there sometimes. That was always trying to work out a schedule was always an impossible task. And so I did some scheduling work, and there was always a changing cast of characters in the scheduling office.
Well, we found quite a few memos complaining about the scheduling operation during that campaign. What do you remember about what the complaints were and how they were handled?
Well, there was always the change of schedule. The change of schedule was always something that seemed to be a difference in perception about what the scheduling office was and was not. The head of the scheduling office, and I can't remember his name now, but I remember he was a character, and I think he came in with was brought in as a campaign professional somewhere along the line, pretty laid back kind of guy. But he thought that his role was to determine where the candidate would go, and that was not really, I think, what Dick's understanding of of the role of the scheduler was. And so there was always this conflict back and forth, and there was, of course, as there is in any scheduling operation, you get kind of a schedule, and the schedule is only as good as the paper that it's written on at the moment it's being written, and of course it always gets changed and it always gets modified. And there was always this updating process that was a continual source of aggravation. That would happen quite frequently. There was always intervention. There was always political intervention, and it always changed the nature of what the output was of that office.
Did you hear of complaints coming from the candidate, Brendan Byrne himself?
Yeah, a little bit. I think the campaign and and the scheduling office always wanted him to do more than he wanted to do on any given day, or the travel and the place to place. It's wearing on any candidate, and I think he bristled a little bit at not being the master of his own destiny, and so that was always a little bit of a problem. And then there was always, the personalities. One of the things that I've accepted over the years is that you cannot be engaged in public policy and gubernatorial politics or campaigns or whatever if your ego gets bruised easily. You have to have a very large ego, or you have to or have none, because it is just one of those things. Everyone is a prima donna, and everyone wants their way. And everyone thinks they know what's best for the candidate and how they're going to get him elected, and how everyone has a different spin or a different take on whether if you're fundraising or whether you're scheduling or whatever it is you're doing, whatever your function is, press office. Everyone has their own spin and their own take. And in a way, it was quite different, for example, than in the McGovern campaign, which was pretty top-down and structured. To a certain degree, and then below that there was nothing. It was all top, top level with nothing underneath it. And in the Byrne campaign had both breadth and depth, and there was an awful lot of thinking and planning, sometimes at odds with one another, but there was always thinking and planning that was going on that was forward-looking. And I found that much more engaging, for example, on a substantive level, than I found working in the McGovern campaign, where it was just really hard to find out what the projection was for that candidate. I think that's part of what engaged me enough to trek every day from Upper Montclair down to Trenton by car and train for 4 years or however long it was. In the Byrne administration, is that it was a challenge, and there were thinking, good, level-headed people, aside from the egos, aside from the things that you could see during the things you could see during the campaign, foretold what the administration was going to be like.
Now, you mentioned some of the key people in the Byrne 1973 campaign. Who were those that you worked most directly with?
Well, probably the press office and the scheduling office more than anything else, although I did a little bit of everything. The press office was fascinating to me because it was translating the message. It was translating the message. And the message had really to do with an overwhelming sense that Brendan Byrne was going to be, the knight in shining armor, that he was clean as a whistle, the judge who couldn't be bought, all the things that the campaign projected, and how to do that, how to get those messages out in a way that didn't sound corny. That he was running against someone who was politically entrenched. Sandman was politically entrenched in the Republican Party. Brendan had a lot more personality and had more pizzazz, but sometimes that's difficult to project that without sounding arrogant or without sounding officious. But it was a campaign full of thinking people, and Brendan was a thinking person, I think a lot of times, because I was relatively a newcomer to state politics, I probably took the issue aspect of things a lot more seriously than those. I would be worrying something and others would be laughing. But it took me a while to get the joke, But the press office was fascinating to me. Because again, it was a translation of the message, and I was so concerned that in my previous experience, that the message of McGovern was never articulated well enough, so that people ever understood what the man stood for or was about.
Backtracking to the primary campaign for a moment. You mentioned Anne Klein as one of Brendan Byrne's opponents. And she was viewed as probably a more liberal candidate, and she was also one of the early women pioneers in New Jersey. You, as a politically active liberal woman, why did you get drawn to her campaign?
The McGovern campaign was a harsh lesson. The one thing I learned is that you can't do anything if you lose. You have to win. And I learned that very quickly. And while I lost a lot of my compatriots to her campaign, and many of those women said to me, Linda, why are you not doing this? And I said, because I don't think she can win. That was the simple reason. And that was a very important lesson that I learned, is you can't get to do the right things. You can't get to implement the things that you think are important and help set the agenda for the things that you think are right if you can't win. And so I thought that Brendan Byrne had a better chance of winning than Anne Klein.
What memories do you have, if any, of your first meeting with Brendan Byrne?
It was so early in the campaign that the offices hadn't even been really set up yet, and he was a member in those days of a firm called Telser, Byrne and Greenberg, and they were doing some organizing on another floor, not in the law firm, but in the same building, and that was the very first time I had ever really spent any time with him, and he wanted to know who I was and what I was doing and so forth. And it was a very cordial, and I found him to be funny, to be witty, to take things just seriously enough, but not too seriously. And I found that an enormous relief, because I was being pretty intense myself. And I found that his way has a way about him that will either make you terribly uncomfortable or put you at ease. And in my case, I took a breath of relief, because I was pretty nervous that this, for me, having come from this very serious loss and having made a very conscious decision, having evaluated it for myself, that I really thought, despite the problems in Essex County, that he could win. And I judged the campaign, and I made a decision. And then I was afraid that maybe I had made the wrong decision, and so I was feeling very uptight. And after I met him, I decided, you know what? This is okay, because he seems to have a very level head about this. Yes, he wants to be governor, and yes, he wants to win. But it didn't sound like, to me, that he would be so intense that we couldn't have fun at the same time.
Some have said, however, that that sense of fun and wit didn't really show itself very well in that first campaign. Do you agree?
Yeah, yeah. Because there was so much going on. It didn't come through. Again, this message business, you know, is so important, because it's very hard in any campaign. It's very hard to, on one hand, allow the person, the candidate as a person, come through and let their personality show through, and at the same time get the job done of trying to create the environment within which that person can win. You need to project the kind of leadership, and you need to project whatever the image is that you know that this candidate has, and you know that the audience out there, the voter, will understand. And so you're constantly looking for those kinds of things. And that's right. The kind of balance that we could see from inside the campaign didn't necessarily project itself.
Did you get a chance to get out of the office at all and attend the campaign speeches, press conferences, debates?
Oh, yeah. We did that, but that was more of my own making. In other words, I didn't travel with the candidate. If there was, the advance team was always, fun And occasionally, if they were shorthanded or something, a whole bunch of us would go. And the campaign was you did whatever needed to be done. That's what campaigns are. You spend a lot of time doing nothing or running frenetically. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any, any other condition. It's either hot and heavy and you're late for something, or something is behind schedule, or you're revamping something, or you're responding to something, or you're trying to get out in front of something. There isn't anything that's ordinary about it. And then there were those lull times. And the lull times were kind of fun because you really got to know some of the people that you were working with. You got to know who they were and how they thought, and how they laughed or they didn't, and what struck them as funny and what didn't. And see, it was really an exercise in understanding people and people and relationships among them. I remember there were certain things about the campaign that, for example, there were certain places that we didn't have candidate Byrne go. Camden was a problem at one point. Hudson County in certain places was a problem at another point. It's very difficult when you don't have the support of the county chairman in Essex County. And if you want to keep your image, a certain projection of your image, the man who couldn't be bought, this honest, the judge, all these things that would resonate with the public, and then somehow get embroiled or entangled with individuals or places that were associated with things that you didn't want the candidate to be associated with. So if you kind of kept blocking out the places where you could go or you couldn't go, or you could say something or you couldn't say something, that stifles the projection of the candidate and the personality and that sort of thing.
As you saw Brendan Byrne at these public events, what was your take on how well he was doing?
Sometimes he was really good and sometimes he was really awful. I mean, that's like we all are, we all have our moments.
What were his strengths and weaknesses?
Well, he was very good at getting to the heart of things. A quick study on things. He could always size it up pretty well. And sometimes he would be right there and he would be really good. He always understood what was going on around him. But sometimes he would, I don't know exactly how to say this, he would play with it. He had a playful aspect to him, where sometimes he took things that were very serious, and instead of being serious about it, he would use humor or whatever, and sometimes it was misunderstood. Or sometimes he just didn't engage. Sometimes he just, he didn't want to be there, he wasn't in the mood, he was tired, he was dragged around too much that day or whatever it was. So it really depended. It really depended. Like all of us, candidates are people, and some candidates are better candidates than others, meaning they're always up for the moment or the shot or the newspaper interview or whatever. And I don't think that that Brendan Byrne was always up that way. He just was more of a real person, and he just could be pushed so far, and then he would balk. I think that was really what it was.
Among the campaign staff, was there some feeling that he was doing his homework on the issues, or that he was going out sometimes unprepared?
I don't know. I don't know. I wasn't there to judge and measure all of those events. I know there were always briefing papers, and there was always detail that was provided. I can't tell you whether or not he read them all the time or digested them, or I just don't know. I mean, I wasn't there accompanying him on everything that he did and every place that he went. We would dismiss, when you're in a campaign, whatever you see in the paper the next day, you dismiss to some degree because it's coming from the other side, and you know what you're putting out there, and so you know you're going to get coming back. So you weren't always really in a position to judge. The way that judgment would come through would be from people in that county or in that community, at some political level would have discussions in the campaign about, if you're going to do this, do it this way. You have to, you have to be for this community. You have to have this spin or that or whatever it is. But I wasn't always out there to judge whether or not he was winging it or whether he was scripted and following the script. I have never known him as a person to be a scripted kind of guy. I don't think that's who he is. On the other hand, he knows things. He studies things, and he is a quick study, and he's a smart man. So it doesn't take a lot for him to figure out what's going on, and he knew a lot about a lot of the issues in advance. He'd always been a star, so to speak, and a bright man, and recognized as such.
In the final days before the primary election, what were the primary responsibilities that you were working on?
Oh, geez. I think it was getting ready for the election day poll, the apparatus, county by county. I was engaged with, there were several different counties that we were working with. They were, people allocated to different responsibilities for different areas of the state. And we were working with, there were some union people who were going to be doing election day polls in various places for us, and it was organizing both the union and non-union people as to who was going to go where, and a classic field operation. And that was a very important part of the close of the primary, was trying to get the field operation going.
By this point, had David Garth come into the campaign?
I can't remember whether he came in toward the end of the primary. I think so. I think the original consultant had either left or was fired out or something. And I don't think that first consultant lasted very long. I really can't remember the time frame in there, because by then I was engaging directly with the people who were in the campaign, and so I kind of lost track of where they were. I think that boiler room idea, I think that was their invention. There were just a lot of things that there was clashes between the consultants and the people who were running the campaign, and I think they were ultimately let go, and I think David Garth was brought in at some point, but I don't remember exactly what time frame that was.
What do you remember doing on primary election day and also primary election night as the returns come in?
I was back in Essex County. I'm trying to remember where I was watching those election returns come in. I spent part of the time in Montclair, in the field office there, because you can track the statewide stuff from any place. It doesn't really matter where you are. And there was nobody in the state headquarters. Everybody was out someplace. And I think I was in one of the Essex County. It might have been the Montclair office, because I knew the people there. And I lived in that town, so it was easy for me to get there and track things. And then it was a matter of, once all of that was in place, there was nothing else to do. I mean, once you got it set up, there was just the pacing back and forth and watching the returns come in and that sort of thing. And there were lots of different people in lots of different places doing that. And wherever Dick was and wherever Brendan was, I wasn't there. I was out in the field.
What was your reaction election night?
Couldn't believe we actually did it. I mean, we knew we were doing it, the numbers were looking good, but you never really know. Even though you can project, and even though, the people who are crunching numbers for you professionally, and you're keeping track of them, at least I was myself, and adjusting numbers and calling people that you knew to get a handle on, sampling what was going on. It's nothing like we actually did it. That was just a remarkable thing.
Of course, one of the great surprises also of that day was that Congressman Sandman was nominated by the Republican Party. Did you feel immediately that elected Brendan Byrne as governor?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. That's why the general election was quite different than the primary, and the state headquarters was a different place, and it was some of the dynamic that I mentioned earlier between the scheduling office and that was all in the general election by then, and there was the fun in the press office at the time. I remember it was a very funny. We were punchy, and we were just punchy. We were told the big discussion was the income tax and whether or not Brendan was going to bring an income tax, and they were parrying back and forth on the income tax, and we were trying to play with images and play with words and to see what we could do, and there were just some very funny moments where we were coming up with things that of course no campaign would ever approve, but they were fun to think about and fun to imagine.
Let's talk in more detail about the income tax during the general election campaign, but before we do, obviously within the Byrne campaign staff, the focus was on the Democratic primary, but was it a shock when Congressman Sandman won the Republican nomination?
We weren't shocked. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't personally shocked, but I wasn't paying that much attention, to the jockeying in the Republican Party. I remember moving it ahead to what I was just saying about having some fun with the campaign. Remember that the income tax and what Sandman was proposing was the surtax. That was his counterpoint to the argument over the income tax. And so when we were sitting around the office, we were dubbing him surtax. We had this image on a blackboard, with the knight. And there would be Brendan Byrne in his knight in shining armor with his sword, and he was being dubbed surtax. And of course, it was Sandman on his knee. We just had so much fun. These are not things, of course, that a campaign would ever approve, but they were some of the lighter moments. And I really thought that once Sandman had nominated, that was it. He would win.
Let's talk more substantively about the tax issue during that general election campaign. Since Congressman Sandman is nominated, most of the professional politicians think Brendan Byrne is going to easily win the November election. Was there serious discussion within the campaign about Brendan Byrne coming out more forthrightly during that campaign for some tax proposal?
There was always a debate about that. Yeah, it was a big internal discussion, and it was never really clear what the campaign thought about what would be in the best interest. And so it created, there were some moments where it was clear that some fiscal responsibility was necessary, and there was going to have to be something to be done. But using making the income tax as a campaign issue was very difficult and very tricky and hotly debated.
Do you remember who was arguing on which side of the fence?
No, I don't. It was just one of those kinds of things where no, I don't remember.
Well, now that he has won the nomination, presumably there are quite a new players trying to come into the campaign to get on the Byrne bandwagon. When did you know what your role was going to be in the campaign, and was it something that was communicated to you?
Never did. One of the things that I guess most people don't understand is that there were a lot of people who were engaged in the political process who were not a part of what was to be in Trenton, weren't there as a part of governance or prospective governance. There were a lot of people lining up, and the jockeying for position, so to speak, was kind of interesting to watch. But there were a whole bunch of us who were, I never expected or thought that I would end up in Trenton. For me, that's not what it was about. For me, what it was about was finding somebody that I thought would stand for things that were closer to what I thought should be done in leadership. and to empower people who, like myself, who cared about some larger things, to engage in that process. Never occurred to me, although I saw plenty of people who were quite interested in the jobs aspect of coming to Trenton when it was all over. But I lived in Upper Montclair, and as I said earlier, I was a young mom with a couple little kids and never anticipated that this would become a profession for me. It was more the campaign and the interest in the political process.
Well, immediately after the primary election, did you simply continue going down to the state quarters reporting for assignments?
We were engaged then after the election in some of the inaugural preparations. There, the planning and for the inaugural.
Well, how about before the November election, in terms of changed role during the general election campaign?
You mean my own personal role?
Yes.
Never really changed that much. I volunteered myself. I showed up because there were always things to be done. And wherever I was needed to do something in the state headquarters, I did. And that's really what it was all about. I was a part of the team, but not a part of the to-be governing team. And that was the role I saw for myself in forwarding this process. And so it was as I said, it was the campaign itself was the end for me. It was making sure that somebody good could win and go to Trenton and govern. Never saw myself as a person that would be a part of the governance.
But did the campaign areas in which you were most involved continue to be scheduling, press, and similar as in the primary?
Yeah, exactly. Those were the things that I knew the communities. I knew some of the people in the community, so the grassroots organizing, bringing that information and that understanding to work with the press, to work in the scheduling office, to work on some advanced stuff, to work on some issue paper work, whatever was necessary to do. I did. After the election, there was inaugural planning to be done, was invited to the inaugural festivities and that sort of thing. And then it was all done. I was done. I had achieved my mission. I helped Brendan Byrne become the governor. That I felt was enough. That for me that was enough.
Well, after Brendan Byrne did get the nomination as a Essex County resident, did you see the Essex County organization now come actively in line to support his candidacy during the general election?
It looked like there was a lot of movement. Yeah, there were still some pockets of not resistance, but there was an acknowledgement. If nothing, Essex County politicians were practical politicians, and certainly it was in their best interest to not buck the obvious benefits of having a Democratic governor in the State House of New Jersey. So yes, there was a lot more cooperation after that.
Of course, you also had the unusual situation in Essex County that Martin Greenberg, whom you mentioned before, was now the state Senate nominee from Essex County and had run in the primary with Essex County organization support, and was a former Byrne law partner and one of his oldest and closest friends.
That's right. Marty Greenberg was a bridge. Was a bridge.
Was he really a bridge or a replacement for the county organization?
I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, there was a lot that went on that I did not know about, that I could only surmise based on changes that I saw on the ground, but I wasn't on the inside of the decision making. No reason I should be.
Returning to the tax question, at some point in the campaign, Brendan Byrne comes up with the statement, planned or not, that he did not see the need for an income tax in the foreseeable future. Do you remember that and your personal reaction?
To me, it reflected the debate that was going on regarding whether or not, well, there are two debates. One was the debate that strictly had to do with the campaign itself, and just counting numbers of potential voters who may or may not agree that as a matter of public policy there should be a change in the tax structure. Was the campaign the right place to air that? And then on the other side, how could you avoid saying something about the income tax, because it was already out there? And so the foreseeable future looked to me like a palatable way to try to communicate a message and leave the door open just a little bit to some doubt about what it meant. I wasn't dismayed by it particularly. It didn't trouble me that the practical politics was such that sometimes a foreseeable future is a funny word. What constitutes a foreseeable future?
Do you recall within the campaign staff whether the reaction was that this was a gaffe or that it was a planned statement on the issue?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
During the interview we conducted with Frank McDermott, who was Congressman Sandmann's campaign manager, he said that he thought that if Brendan Byrne came out flatly for an income tax, that he would have lost that election. Do you really think so?
No, I don't. I really don't. I think that while there were moments, ups and downs during the campaign, I think they were just a function of things that happen during campaigns. But I don't think his success as his ability to get elected was as you described. I don't think so. I think he would have won either way. That's just my own personal opinion on it.
Now, did your confidence in Brendan Byrne being elected continue to Election Day?
Well, there were some times when a campaign is kind of like a thrust and parry if you're into fencing. It's like that, and you're always moving, and forward and back in a certain way. And things happen, and there's lots of communications gaps, or as you said, perhaps gaffes from time to time on both sides. And things don't always go as you've planned, and things sometimes get to the point where they seem to be out of control. But I don't think so. I think through it all, while those who were in charge of the campaign are more intensely involved in measuring things, you really can't see the trajectory as well as perhaps those of us who could take a little bit step back. Yes, it was involved on a daily basis, but I wasn't in the position of campaign chairman, so I didn't have to worry each day to death. It looked to me like, and I, as I said, I bet my time and my volunteerism on it, and my efforts, my own personal efforts. The trajectory was headed in the right direction, and did it have little peaks and valleys along the way? Sure, but I never really doubted. I never really doubted that. There was lots of, New Jersey's a tough state. It's a small state, but it's a tough state because people know each other on both sides of the aisle. People know each other for long periods of time very, very well. And they can perhaps read each other, read the momentum of things. But I never really doubted that. I was pretty confident all the way through, despite the setbacks that all campaigns have.
Again, as the final days before the November election approach, were you again involved with sort of the phone bank operation and the review of the poll numbers?
Not so much the phone. That was being done elsewhere. it was really just trying to track. There were certain, key districts, certain bellwether districts that I'd like to look at, and I would look at those. There wasn't any particular responsibility that I had at that point. Again, once you, as in the primary, once you've gotten everything set, you're out there somewhere doing something, but you're not really, there really isn't anything left to do. If it hasn't happened by then, it's not going to happen. And I think that that was the same during the general election.
Let's take a short break.
19 minutes left.
19 minutes. Before we took our short break, we just about got to Election Day, November 1973. What are your memories of Election Day and Election Night?
I remember being in Essex County, and what just came to mind was I can't remember where there were groups of people doing different things on election night, and one of the things that I remember doing was a whole group of us that went out for breakfast at a diner at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's what I remember about election night. The rest of it is like a blur. It's an absolute blur. I remember going from place to place. We were constantly going from one office to another. I think probably because we didn't have anything to do. We weren't out there doing the hands-on. And we were touching base with people and trying to stay in touch by telephone. And I remember 3 o'clock in the morning in a diner somewhere, about 10 of us, trying to decide whether it was time to go home and go to sleep or completely crash or stay up the whole next day and see what would happen. And then that's what I did. I think that I'm trying to remember where that diner was. I think it was in West Orange somewhere, actually. Maybe it was, West Orange. I think it was in West Orange. And I lived in Montclair, so somebody drove me home, dropped me off, and I just slept and slept and slept and read the newspapers the next day. And the next image that I have of that was meetings that I attended to figure out how to get the inaugural committees organized and people dividing up responsibilities for preparing for the inaugural events.
Now, did you know that you were going to have a role after Election Day? Or who told you that they wanted you to work on inaugural planning?
I don't remember. Somebody got a phone call from somewhere. Are you coming? We're having a meeting. Are you going to be there? Or whatever it was. It was all pretty loose. And I just remember showing up and not wanting to work on. There was a lot of fundraising that was going on for the inaugural, and I didn't want to do that. I was tired, and I didn't want to do that. And I don't honestly remember what I did, but I remember that there were meetings, and I remember that it was a lot of contacting of people about various things. But I don't really even remember it. I do remember some of the inaugural events that I went to. I remember staying down in Trenton in a rather seedy place because the whole town was. All the hotel rooms were taken up. There's hardly any place to stay. And I do remember a group of us went down and because we were invited to all these events, we had to stay down there and, black tie, all fancied up. And it was great fun. And we had a good time, and we went from place to place and enjoyed the events. And then I went back home to Montclair, and that was the end of my role.
Before the inaugural, did you not work at all during the transition planning?
No, didn't work at all during the transition.
Well, when was the next time you were contacted about some role in the new Byrne administration?
I had, as you could well imagine, after all of the energy and enthusiasm going from a presidential campaign and right into a gubernatorial campaign, after the dust settled and I finally caught my breath again, it was kind of like, well, where are all these people now, all these friends and acquaintances and whatever that I've made over these couple of years? Where are they and what are they doing? And so I would call around and talk to this one and talk to that one and try to stay in touch. And then one day, and I can't remember exactly how it happened, the Arab oil embargo hit. And everyone was out of gas. And I got a phone call from someone who was in Trenton, from someone during the campaign, and I can't honestly for the life of me at the moment remember who it is, called me and said, we have this real mess on our hands. We've got so much going on down here. This was, I think, the week after the inauguration, or 2 weeks after the inauguration. Some number of weeks, not days, but a few weeks. Can you come down and help? And I said, sure, where are you? And they said, Trenton. And I went, Trenton, that's a long way. Okay, what time do you want me to be? Come down tomorrow. I said, okay, fine. Got up really early in the morning, and I had no gas in my car, and had to siphon gas out of my neighbor's car to put in my car so I could drive down the parkway and then take the train to Trenton and come to the State House to figure out how I could help with this energy crisis. And I thought that was a very auspicious beginning for how I got involved in Trenton and the energy business.
For those too young to remember, describe more about how difficult it was in those days.
Well, when the Arab oil embargo hit the United States, all of the East Coast states who were importers, net importers of energy, relied on supplies that were only available for a limited number of days or weeks to the entire East Coast, let alone New Jersey. And it absolutely crippled the ability to get around. There were gas stations who had only what they had in their underground tanks, or available for a limited number of hours or days supply. And so the ability to just go to your local neighborhood gas station and fill up was sporadic. So people were rushing everywhere trying to hoard gas and fill up. If they owned 2 or 3 cars, they were filling all their cars up. And so it was exacerbating the situation. And what was happening in Trenton, was happening at a statewide level, is that both private citizens, organizations, companies with car fleets, all kinds of enterprise were in a state of panic that they weren't going to be able to operate and the whole state would shut down. And so the whole State House and the whole, in those days, it was there was actually a State House operator, and there was actually a switchboard in the State House. Although this is the 70s, it still was a pretty old communication system. And everything was just getting bottled up because of the nature of the communications that were so intense. So when I finally reached Trenton, I was put into this little office and there were several people that I knew, and all of a sudden I realized that that's where most of the people I knew from the campaign were. They were actually in Trenton. And I was, I think the first group of people I talked to were from Washington. Whatever the federal emergency apparatus was, they were checking with all the states as to what the conditions were. And so there I was in the middle of craziness, smiling, happy because I had just come out of all these campaigns, which were always crazy. And so there I was in the midst of chaos, but trying to figure out, at that point, it was just a handful of us who were trying to figure out what exactly we needed to do. Then the order came, effectively, from the governor, who basically said, whatever we're going to do, get it out of the State House. We're just clogging everything up. We can't get anything done here. It's chaotic. Let's move whatever our infant energy operation, our emergency response operation is going to be. Let's just get it out of the State House. And so that was among my very first assignments, was to figure out how to get what then would become the State Energy Office up and running. And so that's what I did.
Who did you work with?
The first person I worked with was, I think it was Gordon Large, actually, now I come to think of it. It was Gordon Large, and who was part of the campaign. I think he was doing fundraising for the campaign, as a matter of fact. I didn't know him terribly well. And Dick DeCourt. And Dick DeCourt was the counsel to the previous governor. And he was, in fact, was named the first energy administrator. Very, very capable attorney and wonderful man. And there were just others, who over time became the staff. And they were drawn largely from the people from the campaign because they had the energy. They knew how to organize things. They knew how to get the stuff up and running. One of the very first moments I can recall was that I'd found this space. It was a storefront. It was like opening another field office for a campaign. It was that intense. I found this office not too far from the State House. Actually, it was closer to the train station now that I think about it. And we had the telephone company come in and put in this enormous capability to answer phones, because one of the key things that was happening was that the State House was getting all clogged up, as I said, with the amount of inquiry that was coming in. And so we set up this office, and the very first person to visit me in that office was Jim McQueenie. And at the time, he was a New York Star-Ledger reporter. And he wanted to know what was going on. And I was the only one there with the telephone company people. And I was sitting at a desk by myself, trying to write a script for what phone callers would have to address in answering the public. And I had been trying to develop this for a while. And so I was sitting by myself, and the phone company had all these boxes, these little brown phone boxes. And they were all over the place, and they were tying them into the main switchboard. And all of a sudden, everything was operational, and the phones were ringing in the boxes. And there I am, Jim McQueenie from the New York Star-Ledger, and myself picking up phones out of these boxes, saying, yes, you've reached the State Energy Office. Can I take a message? And we did this until finally I just took all the phones and had to take them off the hook because we couldn't possibly handle it. And that was the origins of the startup of what became the State Energy Office.
Now, you mentioned that Dick DeCourt was a key figure in that small office, and that he had been the governor's counsel to Governor Cahill. Did you find that strange?
No, actually I didn't. I don't know why, but he was just a very self-effacing kind of guy. He seemed to take on this responsibility with some grace and ease. He brought his secretary with him. He still maintained an office for a while there. He had an office in both places, and he would go back and forth between the State House and the State Energy Office. He obviously knew the governor well. They had a good relationship, and I think he had faith in his ability to just grab onto something that just was like a runaway craziness that had hit the state and it hit the country, and try to make some reasonable decisions about what the state response should be. The State Energy Office was a real challenge. The craziness went away, people stopped calling, but there were some very serious problems that the state hadn't quite faced before, as the nation hadn't faced them before. It's kind of auspicious that in this day and age we're kind of back there again to some degree. But New Jersey is an energy-consuming state, not a producing state. And most of the energy apparatus, which of course the governor knew well, having been a PUC, Public Utilities Commissioner himself, he understood the system better than most, and was, I think, probably confident that at least in terms of the electrical component, that we were going to be all right. It was just really the motor gasoline situation that was so dreadful. And that's where we adopted the odd and even day program, which was actually pioneered in the Pacific Northwest. I think it was out of Seattle. Washington, I think, if memory serves, it was either Oregon or Washington were one of the first states to implement the odd and even day program. And we were scouting about for models on what would be the best thing to do, and it was quite clear that we had to do something to manage this situation. And so the license plate, odd and even day license plate arrangement, so that we could reasonably control what was turning into be a rather dangerous situation, and that was one of one of the things that I think was important for Dick DeCourt being in charge is that he had a great deal of experience in state government and the operations of state government, and knew a lot about how to go about organizing something like this.
Do you recall who, if anyone in New Jersey, took special credit for proposing the odd-even plan to Governor Burns?
I don't remember who actually took credit for it. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It was a working system that other states had tried, and it looked like it was working pretty well. And I don't remember if there was some credit taken. Again, that was then one of the things that never bothered me particularly was that who took credit for what. I think I mentioned earlier on when we were talking about that, campaigns and government or whatever are full of people with big egos and the need to claim credit for this or that, and so that was always going on, and I didn't pay attention too much to that.
Well, in any event, the odd-even plan did seem to alleviate the situation quite rapidly.
Yeah, it did. It did.
As the immediate crisis ebbed somewhat, what were the other projects of the office and your role?
Well, there was a real sense that we hadn't really looked at the state from a demand perspective, from an energy demand perspective. I had been engaging with a number of organizations and companies, for example. If you're in a business that runs a fleet of cars, your business is dependent upon the resource that had just been shut off, and so there was a rude awakening concerning that kind of vulnerability. If you're engaged, for example, in the food industry or a supermarket industry, you rely on freezers and refrigerators, and would there be electricity shut off? Would there be disruptions of various kinds? And so the implications for demand and understanding what the nature of the demand was in the state of New Jersey became increasingly obvious. Not to everyone, but it was becoming increasingly obvious to understand how energy was used in the state of New Jersey for the first time from a demand perspective. And so we began an effort to understand that, and we worked with, and there was a whole group of us in a task force that was formed, and we worked very closely with Princeton University's Center for Energy and Environmental Studies, who were actively engaged and had been for a while on demand management concepts. And so the end product of that was a task force report to the governor that looked at sectors of the New Jersey economy and how vulnerable they may or may not be to supply interruptions. So it was a demand management report that was the end product of this work. And that was the major substantive non-crisis related enterprise that that we undertook at the State Energy Office. And of course we worked with utility companies, and we worked with various other organizations that had an vested economic interest, and that was the overriding thing that we were working on.
There's also at some point a debate over this temporary state energy office that was created in a bit of a rush as to what its longer-term position should be in the state government, whether it should be elevated to cabinet status, and if so, how. Do you want to describe that to some extent?
Yes, there was both an internal discussion about what should be the disposition of what started out as a crisis management office in the long term. And while there was a recognition that energy was such a broad-based issue, that it should remain independent of the more parochial responsibilities of any given agency of government, any given department, there was just a debate about whether or not it should be independent, as a new department would be, or whether it should be appended to. It was originally an appendage. It was created in but not of the governor's office, and that was a temporary status, and it needed legislative authority to do that. But that was a limited. It was not a permanent thing. The need for the State Energy Office was first debated on the merits, whether or not it needed to continue. And then if it was determined that it should, which most people agreed that it did have a role to play, then where should it go? And ultimately, the decision was made not to make it a full department, and that it should, the governor decided that it should go to the Public Utilities Commission, and that it should be in but not of the report to the Board of Public Utilities, and have a role that way. That was controversial to some degree, but then ultimately that seemed to be the best choice for it. That's where it ended up.
What other initiatives do you remember the office undertaking?
Well, there were education. There was a major education effort that needed to happen in order to move the state toward some more demand management activities, energy demand management activities, conservation, in other words. And so the case for conservation needed to be made. And all of this, I might add, is not going on in a vacuum. We were working very closely with other states within the region. We were working very closely with Washington, that was setting up the Federal Energy Administration at the time, the FEA, I think it was called then. That was the first iteration of energy management out of Washington. And so there were policies and programs and initiatives that were being undertaken. Most of them, if they weren't substantive, such as the demand management investigation and ultimate report that was prepared, they were looking at ways in which education, consumer education, could take place. And so there was a large effort that was put into everything from programs in elementary schools and high schools to educate teachers and students about energy and how energy is used, to real substantive programs that would affect or try to affect and reduce the vulnerability of companies that had to rely on fuels or were heavily energy reliant. The state of New Jersey, of course, is the petrochemical operations were quite intensive. It was an energy-intensive state of heavy use of energy. And so everything from conservation in buildings, conservation in auto fleets. I remember at that time the auto fleet for the state, where the state had always been purchasing a certain type of car for use, reduce the number of cars, reduce the procurement of a particular kind of car to be more energy efficient. And so there were a lot of things state government was doing and recommending to municipalities and working with private sector companies. And so that was really a public outreach, was really the other major undertaking for the State Energy Office.
In terms of the restructuring of the office into a more permanent state agency or department, one of the conflicts which emerged were sort of different ideas from Senator Pat Dodd of Essex County, fellow Democrat, fellow Essex Countyan with Brendan Byrne, and Governor Byrne. What do you recall of the different positions that they took?
I just remember that during the height of the crisis, there was some contact that was made by some mysterious person to Senator Dodd regarding whether or not this Arab oil embargo was a fake, whether or not the tankers were all out there, running in circles, somewhere out off the coast, and that it was a hoax, that somehow it was a hoax, and all of this could be brought in, and X, Y, and Z needed to be done to make sure that New Jersey, and I don't pretend to know what that is. I don't know. I don't know what the mystery was all about. But apparently there was some there was some information that then flowed to the governor's office that the information that the senator had been given was the hoax and not the embargo. And so the senator was then very much on the forefront of having a vested interest in the outcome of what would happen to the state energy office and what the interest in energy would be over time.
Do you think his interest was partly a product of embarrassment?
It wasn't clear to me why he seemed to all of a sudden be vested in this issue, and maybe it was embarrassment. I don't pretend to know the answer to that. I just know that he then took a very active interest in it and was interested in the impact that it would have on the economy, and he was saying those kinds of things and got engaged. In fact, I think he had a bill. He had drafted a bill at one point, and I don't think. At first, I think the idea that was in the bill, I think, was one that the governor had been entertaining. And then once it was in the bill, it somehow got changed. And I wasn't really clear what kinds of signals were going back and forth there. But the upshot of it, and then it got to be that people were lining up, politically were lining up over where this fledgling operation should go. And I could never really figure out why that was occurring. I had my own personal opinions about where it should go and shouldn't go, but ultimately it didn't matter. I think, as I said before, I think the governor had a great deal of experience as being a public utilities commissioner himself, and it seemed like a logical place, as he saw it, for the state energy office to reside within that jurisdiction.
Later, the key people that you reported to in the energy office changed, didn't they?
Yeah, I left the energy office and went to the Department of Labor and Industry, mostly because I didn't agree with the decision that the governor had made on the Public Utilities Commission. It was just an ideological position, I suppose. I understood why he made the decision that he did.
Describe his specific decision
Well, I think
and why
he
you
thought.
disagreed.
I think he thought, and I'm sure he thought, that because energy, aside from petroleum consumption, the major places where energy and energy conservation could take place was within the purview of the Board of Public Utilities. And he wasn't alone. I mean, ultimately, conservation programs all around the country and out of Washington came through the electric utility companies. I always thought, and it was my reasoning, that if you put the utility companies in charge of demand management when they were in the business to sell energy, that there was a conflict. Ultimately, that didn't turn out to be exactly right. So the governor was right. I mean, that was my reasoning at the time, that I thought it was like putting the folks in charge, that they wouldn't give it their best shot, in other words, because they were interested in promoting the sale of energy to consumers, and we were talking about making major cuts in what would be their sales. So that was my reasoning.
Did you feel that perhaps some of the reason for his reluctance to downgrade the position of the Public Utilities Commission in the energy management structure went back to his loyalty to the commission as a former president of the board?
Oh yeah, I think he understood the capability there and understood what the mission was from a perspective that I didn't have. I didn't have that perspective. He sat in that chair. And so I think he understood, or he knew. And I think he also thought that, and maybe I'm just projecting this now, I think that perhaps he understood if there was a place to conserve energy, that it would be within the electric utility sector. I think he understood that. There was a little bit of a disconnect there because the problem was in, petroleum and fuels. The larger demand management, however, was broader than just vehicles. So to the extent that there would be brownouts, or the extent that it would affect companies or would affect the economy of the state in some way, and the conservation that could be achieved on a household and business level largely could be affected through the utility commission, through the Board of Public Utilities. And so the State Energy Office went there, became the department. What did it become? I don't remember. It wasn't called the Department of Energy. I don't know what it was called at that point. I can't remember. But it reported to the board.
Now, you leave the Energy Office
Mm-hmm.
and go to the Department of Labor and Industry, which is headed by Joseph Hoffman, who you first
Mm-hmm.
met during the campaign.
Right, I did.
Did you call him directly about a possible opening there, or was it
I think
more indirect?
so. I think, well, I don't know whether I called him or whether somehow there's lots of, when you know people, they're informal communications, and I just said, I don't believe this is the right decision, but I want to continue to work with the other part of it too. It wasn't just the line in the sand kind of thing, although I did feel strongly about it. It was that I thought that if you really wanted to affect the economy of the state in a positive way, to work with companies rather than work through the utility companies to the companies was a more direct route. That if you really wanted to affect things, that you should go to the companies that are affected and work with them directly. And that's what Labor and Industry did, at least on the industry side of it. And as a part of the economic development function that was in the Department of Labor and Industry, I thought that was a reasonable place to do energy work. And Joe was interested in energy. And he may have been, and now that I've come to think of it, there may have been some relationship between Pat Dodd and whatever his scheme was or idea was for the Energy Office. And Joe was on that page, perhaps, and that may be coming back to me now. And so I just made it known, or he said, if you want to come and do your energy work over here, fine. So I became the quote-unquote energy specialist, was my title, for the Department of Labor and Industry, and it was mostly an economic development function, which gave me access to, and my guidance from Joe was go work with the companies. Go see what you can do with the companies.
And how did you go about doing that?
Well, the first thing I did was go directly to companies. I got to, there were a variety of initiatives. The first way in which I engaged with companies directly was through a set of companies who came to me and said, we think that it's really important to bring some of the federal energy dollars that are now flowing to the states for energy programs to New Jersey for energy research and development. It's not just a matter of just saying we'll conserve energy. There has to be an investment in demand management strategies and technologies, and there is by now the energy apparatus in Washington was called ERDA. It was the Energy Research and Development Administration, and there were dollars flowing to the states for these purposes. So I sat with a number of prominent companies. I remember Tony Shabika, who's long since passed away. He was the president or CEO of Ciba Geigy, and some of the folks from Exxon and Mobil. They used to be two separate companies in those days. Exxon Research and Engineering and Mobil, and a variety of other major players in the state of New Jersey, pharmaceuticals, energy companies, etc. And we formed the first organization that was going to be a private sector organization, with the support and acknowledgement of the state that they would begin to try to bring some of these energy dollars home to the state of New Jersey and try to do some of the demand management and alternative technologies were beginning to be spoken as words and ideas, and that organization did attempt to do that kind of thing, and I helped them do that and got on their first board and that sort of thing. Those were the kinds of things that I was working on, and I was also looking for other opportunities, particularly in alternative energy. And here, if I can claim a little bit of credit for something, it was now the following year, and there was an initiative in Washington to establish what was then called the Solar Energy Research Institute. It's now the Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. It's changed its name and broadened its mission, and it goes up and down in terms of people's consciousness and funding from Washington. But it is a national lab, and I thought it was a great opportunity to bring that national lab to New Jersey, and I made that a major mission, and organized these companies, not the same companies, but some overlap. And I made the case and organized the groups and wrote the proposal with eventually the support of actually Lou Caden, who came to my rescue when I was a little bit needed some funds to go ahead and proceed with doing the kind of job that needed to be done, and made New Jersey a player in the solar energy competition. And we were competing with both sunshine states and with the Northeast. And I made the case on the merits that New Jersey had not only the research capability with RCA and Exxon Research and Engineering and whatever, we had the depth of research and commitment by these companies that alternative technologies were worth pursuing. And we also had the manufacturing capability. I mean, you can't make photovoltaics out of cardboard. You need manufacturing capability to produce energy technologies and produce solar energy technologies. And so I pioneered that, and it was a very, very large undertaking. And I eventually put together a much larger team, mostly private sector help, but some internal help from others. It was very difficult because I was the only one working on energy for the entire state the entire Department of Labor and Industry. And industry in New Jersey is very complex and very large and quite powerful. And at least it was then, and I'm assuming it still is now, but although the nature of the companies have changed. But it was very difficult, but I did make the case for us and worked with the competing interests from the Mid-Atlantic states and the Northeast states, and tried to keep the support. An awful lot of research institutions, including universities, I might add, who were scouting about for allegiances, putting their academic credentials up along with these state initiatives and regional initiatives to bring this plum home to their state. I mean, this was a major event. What ended up to be the case was that you had to have sites, you had to have an actual physical site. I ended up with Fort Monmouth as our site because it had a former capability there and labs there that could be upgraded, and it was at the time, and as it is seasonally and periodically, where there were these movements in Washington to shut forts down, shut military bases down, and of course it was once again it was Fort Monmouth's turn to be on the chopping block, and so I had the support of our congressional delegation, particularly Congressman Howard, who was very pleased to work with us. I had the support of the Army and the naval base next door, and then I had to go and find some land because there wasn't enough land there to meet the requirements for the proposal, and so I went to David Bardeen, the Commissioner of Department of Environmental Protection, and I said, David, I need some land. Can I have some green acres land, please, so that I can submit this proposal to Washington, because otherwise I won't meet the site requirements and they'll throw it out. And so we found some way. I mean, you can't really dedicate green acres land, which was banked land for conservation purposes. You can't really commit that for development, but you could. We could theoretically. There was a way to make it accessible for the purposes of this proposal, and should it ever be designated there, we would work out the arrangements. And so it took. It was a rather mammoth undertaking to be able to do this. And I was very pleased that we had a select staff, and our chosen director was Paul. I'm sorry, I can't remember his last name. He was the solar energy guy at the RCA Sarnoff Research Labs, and he went on. He was our director, with the support of all these companies. And we had quite a nice presentation to make. And he ended up to be the director of the actual Solar Energy Research Institute, which was located in Golden, Colorado. And we were very disappointed, of course, that it went to a Sunshine State, but that's what they decided to do. So we didn't win the competition, but as I said when I started this long story, was that it was recently known to me, just a few years ago after having not been in the state for a number of years, and that there really is a very strong solar energy industry in New Jersey. And when I heard that, I kind of smiled, because while I didn't make it happen, I think creating that base and making that awareness that even an urban state like New Jersey that doesn't have all the sunshine that some of the, quote, sunshine states have, we do have some capabilities here that would render us very strong in a technology, because that's really what solar energy is technology. And it's very gratifying to see that stuck, that that really is a solar energy industry in the state of New Jersey.
Of course, as you get into your job at the Department of Labor and Industry, Brendan Burns' popularity in the state is plummeting as a result of the enactment of the income tax. What was your reaction as an old campaign worker, and also in a department headed by a commissioner who would ultimately decide that he was so disaffected with Brendan Byrne that he would challenge his own governor for renomination?
And that was a very strange time, because while I was not ever a legislative contact, a person that dealt with the legislature at all, the whole income tax issue was a massive issue that was going on completely independent of what I was doing. But I could see and feel the effects, because you couldn't be there and not feel the effects of it. The governor's ratings were very, very low. People who were very supportive of I think initially even the concept of passing an income tax were beginning to get into the downward spiral that sometimes happens when key leaders lose their popularity. And it becomes like a feeding frenzy, and it affected. I think it affected everyone's demeanor, affected the way in which business was conducted. It was like a lot of baggage that was hung around. It was not a good time in the administration. It really wasn't, and it was tough. It was really tough, and no matter what you were doing, whether you were directly working, on the income tax issue or not, you were affected by it.
From terms of morale?
Yeah, and people were down. And as I said, there's this self-defeating kind of mentality that occurs when you feel like you're under siege, and no matter what you do, you can't figure out how to get up out of the hole. That was a particularly difficult and trying time, and the morale was bad.
Did you discern any signals coming out from Joe Hoffman's office of his special disenchantment with Governor Byrne?
Yeah, I could see that Joe was saying some things. There were a lot of people who were not saying things publicly, but they were saying things privately, and I think Joe was being a little outspoken rather than being more discreet, perhaps.
In terms of criticizing Governor Byrne?
Yeah. The criticism from within the cabinet was, that's kind of disloyalty, if you will. I'm not calling Joe disloyal, but I'm just saying the concept of when you don't quote unquote kick him when he's down, kind of thing. That was tough. It was a tough period. On the other hand, everyone had their political constituencies and had their position and had their departments, and they were constantly being bombarded themselves, as Joe was, with, well, what's your governor doing? What's going on there? You know, this kind of thing. And as I said, this downward spiral. Different individuals react differently in their responses to those things. And his reaction, although, as I said, it didn't engage me necessarily, I was off doing my solar energy thing, was to be critical.
Do you think that the criticism might have been more severe within the Department of Labor and Industry because the two constituencies there, organized labor and the business community, were particularly negative about Brendan Burns' programs?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why I was trying to say that, you know, each department has its own constituency, and in the case of this one, that's right. There were if there was reason for not being supportive of the governor's initiatives, they would likely come from the business community and the labor community, and there they were, you know, joined in this one department, and that was Joe's responsibility, and that was his constituency for the responsibility that he had. So yeah, I mean, then again, that becomes one of these self-fulfilling things. If you hear it all day long, and you hear the people you're dealing with griping all the time and complaining all the time, you know, it does affect the way in which you think about things.
Do you recall when you first understood that Commissioner Hoffman's disaffection was actually going to lead to his resigning from the cabinet to challenge Brendan Byrne in the primary?
You know, I had heard, because there were people working in his department, and increasingly I noticed that some of the quote-unquote old campaign staff were being brought on board, and I would look around and say, oh, so-and-so's coming into the department, and kind of, you know, and then, you know, I began to fully understand, and Joe would say things from time to time, and you know, and I kind of resisted all of that. I said, well, you know, I always try to stay out of that, and then ultimately I couldn't. Ultimately, I had to make a decision, and that's when I decided to leave, because I wasn't going to be caught between my governor and my commissioner. I couldn't be in that position. I mean, that was a very, very difficult, for me, nobody, you know, I don't think anybody would have said anything one way or the other, but I just felt like I couldn't do that. I couldn't work for somebody who I admired. Joe was a good, solid, smart guy, and he supported everything I did with energy, and he never, you know, he helped me when I needed help. He never at all, when I would run to for assistance to Luke Hayden or to Dick or to Bill Highland or whatever, it was never a problem. He was never provincial about where I could go. All he required of me is to tell him what initiatives I was undertaking and find out what support he could provide to me. And then I would keep in touch with either briefing memos, or I would call Franny, his secretary, and say, tell Joe this or that or whatever. And so it was a very good working relationship, and I had a lot of freedom, as I was given a lot of freedom from day one in the Byrne administration to do what needed to be done to support the mission, and my responsibility was energy to work on. I got no more guidance than, well, then go work with the companies. You know, that sort of thing. So I felt I was in an untenable position. I certainly wasn't going to go and work in a campaign either for or against one of these two men, both of whom I thought were good people, although I didn't necessarily think that Joe was making the right decision by doing what he was doing. And as it turned out, it was the wrong decision that he made. I think he was given, you know, as I said, everybody's got ego, and when people come to you and tell you you can do this, you know, why not? You know, and he had a constituency and some labor people and so forth that were telling him that they would support him and that he could do this. And he thought he could. I think it turned out to be a mistake for him.
When did you leave the department, and what did you do?
I was very actively engaged in the kind of work that I just described, and there were other projects. I mean, there was a very large, I started the very first energy conservation conference in Cherry Hill for business and industry. That was the first one in the country. It was before the US DOE then created theirs. And the one we created in New Jersey got taken over by the State Energy Office, in Newark, and it ran for every year for about 14 years. Well, we launched that. I launched that essentially with an idea that if I was going to work with business and industry, let's really do this. We had, there were 1,000 people, and Frank Zarb, who was the first energy czar in Washington, came, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal to do this. Governor came and made a major keynote speech. I mean, so there were a lot of things that I was doing that were big, big undertakings, and the work that I had been doing, people were aware of. It was not the kind of thing that you could hide under a bushel, and I made it known that I thought I was going to have to do something about my situation. And the Princeton Center contacted me and said, well, why don't you come over here and work with us? You've got now practical, political and public policy perspectives that we in our Center for Energy and Environmental Study could use in pursuing our research and our activities, particularly in conservation, and particularly with industry and with the utility companies and the other companies that you've been working with. So, I mean, how do you turn down a nice offer like that? You don't. So I went to Princeton, and I stayed there for 4 or 5 years.
When did you join Princeton?
Oh, let's see. I think it was in 1976. I think it was 76. When would the... yeah, I think it was 76. It was before the primary, the year before the 6 months or 8 months before the primary.
Commissioner Hoffman resigned.
It was, yes. I can't remember whether he had formally declared or not, but it was clear that he was going to at least throw his hat in the ring for it, and I just wanted to get out at that point, and so I did. And in fact, it was a very funny situation where I wrote letters to all of these companies. I know I'd been working with all of these people for a long time now, for a couple of years on these big projects. First, the solar energy research, RFP research, establishing to bring the Solar Energy Research Institute to New Jersey, and then the conservation conference, and they were all the same companies, in the leadership roles. And so I'd gotten to know some pretty nice people that I had very good working relationships with. And so I wrote them all letters, and I said, I'm telling you I'm leaving, I'm going to Princeton, whatever. And I just got back tons and tons of very gratifying responses. So I felt really good about that, and I felt like I was making a graceful exit. And just before I was ready to go, the irony of ironies, I get a phone call from, all of this that I experienced and remember, and a lot of it I'm recalling as I'm talking here. I was a political appointee, which is why I had the freedom that I had. I wasn't a part of the bureaucracy that actually makes state government work and run. And in the Department of Labor and Industry, there was this whole apparatus. I mean, there were responsibilities that are legal responsibilities for certain kinds of things, and workman compensation, and a whole bunch of other things that the state of New Jersey is responsible for, and the authority is vested in the Department of Labor and Industry. And there are key people who are in charge of the department to carry out these functions. And the head guy, whose name I can't remember, called me into his office, and I had never met with him. I mean, I'd been in state government now for several years. I knew his name, but I'd never met with him because I reported directly to Joe, to the governor's political appointee. And so he called me into his office, and I was a little bit nervous about it because I had never dealt with him before. And he told me that I probably could have a very good future in the Department of Labor and Industry, and that people liked me, and that I had done well, and did I want to sign on? And I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. He was basically offering me a position in state government rather than the public policy political appointee position.
Classified civil
classified civil service position, which had never occurred to me any more than working in the campaigns. It had ever occurred to me that I would end up working in Trenton. So I didn't know what to do with that. I said, well, thank you very much, you know, and he said, well, why don't you think about it and get back to me? Well, I didn't know what to think about that at all. And here I was on the verge of leaving anyway. And so I picked up the phone and I called Dick. And I said, Dick Leone, and I said, Dick, I need to talk to you about something. And so I went in and I sat down and I told him what happened. And he said, well, is that something you want to do? I said, well, why would I want to do that? He said, well, then I guess the answer is no, you don't want to. I said, well, is there something wrong if I say no? In other words, do I create a problem for anybody if I say no? He goes, no, you can do what you want. But I didn't know. And here I was several years into my employment in the state of New Jersey, and I didn't have a clue what this man was really talking about. And I thought that was kind of absurd in a way. But it says something about the nature of the differences in experience that one has when one is part of the cog, the wheels that actually make the state of New Jersey run, and those who come in from the political side and have an opportunity to push the envelopes and make changes.
Now that you've left state government and are at Princeton, did you simply watch the 77 re-election campaign?
Yep.
Did you have any temptation to get more involved?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I think whatever the itch was, it had been scratched, and I was. There was an evolution for me, a personal evolution, where I went from being totally intrigued by the political process to being completely immersed in the policy side of governance, and that was just a personal evolution that ended up at a university think tank, if you will, although they didn't describe themselves that way, a research apparatus, but focused on public policy. And that was basically what the center was all about, was public policy. And so I made this transition. And I think I was very fortunate to have the kinds of experiences that I had, because I had an understanding of what was possible. At least I had my interpretation of what I thought was possible to achieve in public policy coming from the political arena. So I didn't think public policy was made in the bureaucracy. It's made through the political process.
You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but did you vote for Brendan Byrne over Joe Hoffman in the primary?
Of course I did. Of course I did.
And I assume you were happy when he won re-election.
Of course I was. Of course I was.
Briefly, give us a very quick sketch of what you've been up to since you left the Byrne administration, first at Princeton.
Well, when I was at Princeton at the center, I had an opportunity to what I call put some of the meat on the bones of the initiatives that I had undertaken and the experiences that I had. When you're in state government and you're moving from crisis management into all of these other large projects and all of the things that I didn't describe in between. Didn't talk about the Cabinet Energy Committee and all the workings of how to integrate energy throughout state government and so forth and so on. So there's a lot that went on, and I was absorbing and doing all at the same time. And so going to the university was an opportunity for me to take a deep breath and work on the depth a little bit more. And so I did that, and I learned an awful lot and had something to offer them based on my policy experience and understanding what may be feasible. You have the luxury when you're at a university to look forward to the future. And so I always used to say that when I was in state government, I looked, 1 foot in front of the other. When at the university you have an opportunity to look decades ahead, and so your perspective on things changes when you have that. Oddly enough, One of the things that I discovered is that even though we were putting one step in front of the other in terms of energy in that particular period in history and that particular time in the Byrne administration, we were not inconsistent with ultimately what I discovered after putting the flesh on the bones and looking way ahead. We were pretty right on, and I feel very good about that. I mean, all the things that we sought were the right things. We emphasized demand management. We emphasized working with industry, working both on the alternative technology side and on the demand management side. All the things we did were the right things. I mean, the fact that the nation hasn't progressed very far was not because we were doing the wrong things. It just didn't happen that way. So after I left, after I stayed at the university for a while, it became difficult there because President Reagan had been elected, and all the money that was flowing to do that good kind of research was just cut in one big swath. And it was very difficult. And people who were being supported by these research grants, mostly from Washington monies, were just scrambling around. The private foundations were picking up some of the slack, but not all of the slack. And I thought it was time. There were predecessors who had left New Jersey state government and gone to the center for a year or so, and I had been there for, I think, 4.5 years or something like that. And I thought it was time, to step aside. I had been working as the funds were cutting back. I spent part of my time working at the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies, and then I did some work for the Dean of Engineering. The center was located at the engineering school, and I became acquainted with and worked part-time for, actually about a third of my time, for Bob John, the Dean of the Engineering School, who was very supportive and helped create the center, so he was willing to extend the funds to support the rest of my work. But once your support is coming that way, it's not good, and it's not going to have a long-term effect, and there's no reason to overstay a welcome that way. So I left the university and I started to do some independent consulting, which was great. I had an opportunity to kind of test my wings, so to speak, saying, well, I really do know a lot of things now. I'm not as I'm quite educated on the topic of energy and energy policy, and I found that there really were people who were quite interested in that. So I had some very nice clients that I did some work for, and then ended up moving to Washington, where I worked for an engineering firm that had a contract to provide support to the Department of Energy, and so I had an opportunity to then work at a federal level with the Department of Energy by being employed by a private engineering firm. And from there I moved to Chicago, where I became a director at a research institute, a university-based research institute that was largely a Department of Defense contractor. And so we did an awful lot of DOE and DOD work, research and development work. And I first started out on the research side of the house. I was brought in, it was actually an odd story, talk about how people have common interests and therefore end up with an understanding and a relationship that you know will work. The president of this research institute happened to be the head of the proposal effort, as I was in New Jersey, to bring the Solar Energy Research Institute. He was the head of I think Battelle. He was at Battelle at the time, and they were one of our competitors. And this guy was the head of the Battelle proposal, so we were competitors at the same time, and he was the president of this research institute. And when we found that out, there was instant, simpatico there, and he said, "Why don't you come and work here and bring an energy policy capability? And maybe we can do some good energy policy analysis and good energy policy work here." And the first thing I got immersed in after I moved to Chicago and took on this responsibility was to work with the state of Illinois and the Fermilab, And I had the great pleasure to work with Nobel Prize winner Leon Lederman, who was the head of the Fermi Lab at the time. The Fermi Lab was the chosen site for the state of Illinois to put the ill-fated superconducting super collider, which is one of those large particle physicist machines, to put a larger collider in the state of Illinois, located at the Fermi Lab. And so that was my first. I leaped to Chicago from Washington and was doing energy work once again. And this, of course, big physics energy is quite different than the other kind of energy that I had been used to dealing with. But energy was energy, and so that was the way it was viewed. And so I was engaged once again in very large projects that involved states and federal government and energy, and working with technology, private sector, and now national labs. And so the work that I had begun and the expertise that I had developed in New Jersey state government, and then in at the university at Princeton, and then through my private consulting work, was now culminating in Chicago in this research institute, where I stayed for quite a number of years and left the research side of the house and became a director with a big department, to where how it is, you lose the as you move up the ladder, you lose the hands-on the substance of things, and then you start doing a traditional management kind of job. You hire and you fire and you worry about parking places and things like that. So that was the history through Chicago. At that point, we were looking for a place in the mountains, and we ended up purchasing some land in Wyoming and building our dream house in the mountains, and had consulting firm again, left Chicago, left that organization, and went back to private consulting, and that was 15 or 16 years ago now. I'm still doing that.
And relatively recently, you've come back to the state, at least part-time.
Yes, that's right.
Continuing to have your house in Wyoming.
That's exactly right, and continuing with our company.
What's your reaction to New Jersey after being away for several years?
Too much traffic, I'll tell you. One of the things that it has gotten, it was always, a tightly developed state because it's so small. But it has grown so much over the past years. It really has been, especially central Jersey. And I lived in Upper Montclair, but then I moved down to the Princeton area. And what's happened between the Middlesex County, Mercer County areas is beyond belief. It's just this explosion of highways and traffic and houses and townhouse complexes, and it's just a rather amazing thing to see what has happened. Of course, my family's still here, and most of North Jersey looks about the same to me. That doesn't look that much different, or pockets of it do, but most of that remains the same. And of course, the roads, there are some new roads here that weren't here before, but I've figured out where they go now, and I don't get too lost. But this area of the state, central Jersey, has really just exploded, absolutely exploded. And of course, living in New Brunswick now, New Brunswick, when I was here last, was kind of a bombed out place, It was pretty bombed out. And it's come back. It is just amazing to see, and I live right downtown, so I'm urban pioneering, if you will, but it's nice. It really is nice, and it's wonderful to see that come back. It really is wonderful to see that. And I haven't been up to Newark yet to see, I've been to places, but I haven't really gone to Newark and looked around to see whether things have changed up there too. I've been to the hospital complexes, and I know of all the development there, and that I guess is there's a lot happening now. I can just tell, in and around the places that I drive in Newark, were whole neighborhoods that were just bombed out and boarded up, seem to be under redevelopment, although people tell me that they've been in redevelopment for a long time, and it's moving a lot slower than perhaps New Brunswick is moving. So I don't really have a good handle on that. But I just know that New Brunswick has just turned around amazing. It's just absolutely amazing to me to see what's happened here.
Before we close, any final thoughts on the Byrne administration, Brendan Byrne as governor, as person, or anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, I think that I really owe a great deal to the experience that I had in working for the governor. I always considered myself working for the governor no matter where I worked or no matter what I did, because he allowed that to happen. He allowed, I don't mean me personally, but he allowed, by the very nature of the way he ran his administration, a great deal of freedom to allow some people to grow and to learn and to provide the support system for them. And I always knew that if I needed help or I ran into trouble or I was running a little bit too fast and couldn't catch up with myself, that I could always pick up the phone and call anybody and get the support that I needed. And that was a terrific experience. You don't often have that. You really don't often have that. And no matter what kind of a job you have or what kind of a career path you've chosen for yourself, it's not all that obvious to me that many people have had the kind of experience that I had. And especially someone who started out, in the process with never having a goal except to get a president elected, which I was not able to do, help get a governor elected, which I feel I was able to do, and then built a career. And the career wasn't a career in government. I mean, a lot of people make careers in government. It wasn't that kind of a career. It was a personal growth career for me. And I got that from the opportunity that his administration provided.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.